Keanu Reeves had always enjoyed the quiet of the early morning. The world seemed to still, untouched by the rush of life that would come later in the day. It was his sanctuary, a time when the demands of Hollywood, fame, and endless obligations could melt away, if only for an hour. On this particular morning, Keanu decided to take a walk through the park near his home. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the dew-kissed grass. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant chirp of birds. It was a peaceful scene, almost surreal in its calmness. But even in the serenity, something felt off. Keanu's steps slowed as he noticed two little girls standing by a large oak tree. They were identical twins, no older than 7 or 8, dressed in black dresses with lace trims that fluttered slightly in the morning breeze. Their pale faces were framed by jet black hair, their eyes, dark, intense, staring right at him. The unsettling thing wasn't just the way they looked, though. It was the way they seemed to be waiting for him, their eyes never leaving him as if they knew something he didn't. Keanu hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach. Something in his gut told him that this was no ordinary encounter. He continued walking, the distance between him and the girls closing with each step, but still, they didn't move. They simply stood there, waiting. As he passed by them, the twins simultaneously turned their heads and spoke in perfect harmony. "Keanu," one of them whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft morning breeze. "We've been waiting for you." Keanu stopped dead in his tracks. The chill that ran down his spine wasn't from the cool morning air, but something deeper, something unsettling. He turned back to face the girls, their faces now expressionless, but their eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, pierced through him like they were looking right into his soul. Who are you?" Keanu asked, his voice unsteady, though he wasn't sure why. He had spoken to hundreds of strangers in his life, but these two girls made him feel like he was a stranger in his own skin. The twins didn't answer at first. Instead, they just smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. "You'll understand soon enough," the other twin spoke now, her voice as soft and ethereal as the first. "Everything has a purpose." Keanu felt his heart race as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this some sort of prank? Was someone filming him? He scanned the area around him, but there were no cameras, no crew. Just him and these two little girls. "Why me?" Keanu asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "What do you want from me?" The twins exchanged a glance, as if sharing some private understanding, before one of them spoke again. "We want nothing from you, Keanu. We're here to help you," she said, her voice strangely comforting, though it didn't ease the unease building within him. Keanu felt a strange tug in his chest, a sensation, like something buried deep within him was awakening. He could feel the weight of his past pressing in on him, memories he hadn't thought about in years rushing to the surface. But before he could process any of this, the girls turned away and started to walk toward the nearby woods. Their movements were fluid, almost dreamlike, as though they weren't entirely bound by the rules of reality. Keanu watched, mesmerized, as they disappeared into the shadows of the trees. A sudden urgency gripped him. What had just happened? He needed to know more. He couldn't just let it go. He had to follow them. Without thinking, he found himself walking toward the woods, his steps quickening as if the twins were pulling him in with an invisible force. The air grew heavier as he entered the trees, the peaceful serenity of the park replaced by an eerie stillness. The woods seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing deeper with each passing moment. There was no sign of the twins. He looked around, scanning the dense underbrush, but they had vanished. The further he walked, the more he felt like he was losing himself in the unfamiliar forest. It was as if time itself had warped, and he was caught in a moment that didn't quite make sense. Then, suddenly, he heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Keanu, you can't run from it." He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was both familiar and strange, like a memory he couldn't quite place. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "What do you want from me?" The twins' voices echoed back to him, this time with a sense of urgency. "You're lost, Keanu, but we can help you find your way." Keanu's mind raced. This was all too much. He was a man who prided himself on keeping his life together, on making sense of the chaos around him. But this was beyond him. And yet, there was something undeniable about their words, something that stirred a deep, unresolved feeling inside him. He had spent so many years running from his past, avoiding the pain of loss, regret, and grief. But in the presence of these strange little girls, he could no longer escape it. His legs trembled as he took a step forward, and then another, as if being drawn deeper into the forest, deeper into a past he had tried so desperately to forget. "Keanu," the voice whispered again, this time softer, almost like a caress. "You don't have to be afraid." He turned, expecting to see the twins standing there, but there was nothing. The woods had fallen silent once more. Keanu's breath caught in his throat as a wave of dizziness washed over him. The world around him seemed to shift, as though the very fabric of reality was bending. He reached out to steady himself, but there was nothing to hold on to. And then, as quickly as it had all begun, the air seemed to clear. The forest was still. The strange, eerie presence that had been following him had dissipated, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Keanu blinked, trying to regain his bearings. Had it all been a dream? Was he imagining things? But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The twins were real, and somehow they were connected to something much larger than he could understand. The question lingered in his mind as he stood there alone in the quiet woods. What did they want from him? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just happened. The encounter with the twins wasn't something easily dismissed. It was as if their presence had cracked open a door he had spent years trying to keep locked. His mind raced, the mysterious encounter playing over and over in his head, every detail vivid in his memory. Their eyes, their words, the strange pull they had on him. He hadn't told anyone about what happened. The last thing he wanted was for people to think he had lost his mind. The weight of the encounter pressed heavily on him, but it wasn't the eerie experience that bothered him most. No, it was the undeniable connection he felt to those two little girls. The way they knew his name, the way they seemed to speak directly to the deepest parts of him, the parts of himself he had long tried to forget. The next morning, he woke up early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. He stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, staring at his reflection, wondering if he was still the man he had been before the twins. The Keanu Reeves the world knew, the actor with the calm exterior and the quiet demeanor. Was that the same man who had just walked into the woods, heart racing, chasing shadows? He grabbed his jacket, a plain leather one he always wore for walks, and made his way outside. The air was cool, and the streets were still empty. He needed to clear his head. He needed to think. His steps took him to a small cafe he often visited in the mornings, a quiet, low-key place where he could drink his coffee in peace. The regular barista, a young woman named Ellie, greeted him with a friendly smile as he entered. "Hey, Keanu. Usual?" she asked. "Yeah, thanks," he replied, offering a faint smile. He sat at his usual corner booth, the same spot he'd sat at for years. It was his haven, the place where he could be just another guy having his coffee. But today, it felt different. Everything felt different. His fingers tapped nervously on the table, his mind elsewhere. He tried to focus on the newspaper in front of him, but the words blurred. The twins' faces kept flashing in his mind, their dark eyes staring into him, their cryptic words echoing. "We've been waiting for you." He took a deep breath, pushing the memories aside for the moment. This wasn't the first time he'd been haunted by something from his past. His life hadn't always been the fairy tale it appeared to be in the media. Beneath the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, there was a man who had lost a lot, too much. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood, to the family he had left behind. The house in Toronto, his mother, who had raised him alone, and most of all, his sister, Emma. Emma had been everything to him. They were close, inseparable even. Growing up, they'd shared everything. secrets, dreams, and the occasional childhood rebellion. But when Emma died in a tragic accident just a few years ago, Keanu had lost a part of himself. The pain of her loss had been too much to bear, and he had thrown himself into work to escape it. But no matter how hard he tried, the grief never left. It was a year after her death when the grief finally consumed him. He had become a shell of the person he used to be, hiding behind the walls of his home, only stepping out when necessary. His career had been a lifeline, but even that didn't feel the same anymore. Without Emma, everything felt hollow. As his coffee sat untouched, Keanu thought back to the moment Emma died. He had been filming in a foreign country when he received the call. She had been in a car accident, a sudden, tragic crash that left her life hanging by a thread. The accident had been a blur of hospital visits and phone calls, but in the end, it was too late. He hadn't been there for her. He hadn't been able to protect her, and that guilt had haunted him every single day. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the memory wash over him. He thought he had moved past it, but the truth was, he had only buried it deep within himself. And now, it seemed like those buried feelings were resurfacing, forcing him to confront them once again. Suddenly, the sound of the door chiming snapped him back to the present. He looked up and froze. There they were, the twins. They were standing in the doorway of the cafe, looking directly at him. Their black dresses were still as pristine as they had been the day before, and their dark eyes locked onto his as though they were waiting for him to make the next move. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. He quickly turned his head away, hoping they hadn't seen him, but in the corner of his eye, he noticed they were moving toward him. "Keanu," one of the twins said, her voice as soft and unnerving as it had been before. "You need to listen." He didn't know how they found him or why they were here, but the air around him grew heavy. His chest tightened as he tried to maintain his composure. He couldn't run from them again. Not this time. The twins sat down across from him, as though they had every right to be there. "Why are you here?" Keanu asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have questions," the other twin said, her voice calm but firm. "We have answers." Keanu was silent, his mind racing. Answers? What answers could they possibly have? "You've been hiding from the truth for too long, Keanu," one of them continued. "The past isn't finished with you." Keanu stared at them, unable to find the words to express what he was feeling. Fear, confusion, curiosity, everything was swirling inside him. "I don't understand," he finally managed. "What do you want from me? Why me?" The twins exchanged a glance, a quiet understanding passing between them before they looked back at him. "You need to face what you've been running from," the first twin said softly. "Only then will you find peace." Keanu felt the weight of their words, and the sense of dread he had been trying to ignore grew even stronger. What could they possibly know about him that he didn't? And how could they know so much about his pain? But the twins weren't just a reminder of the past. They were the catalyst for something deeper, something that, whether he liked it or not, was going to force him to confront the darkness inside him. He couldn't avoid it anymore. He had to face the truth. For the first time in years, Keanu felt like the walls he had built around himself were crumbling. The twins stood up, ready to leave, their eyes never leaving his. "We'll see you soon, Keanu. The truth is waiting." And with that, they turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Keanu alone with his thoughts once again. He sat there, staring after them, feeling as though his entire world had shifted beneath his feet. The past wasn't finished with him, and the twins were just the beginning. Keanu's hands trembled as he stared into his cup of coffee. The twins' cryptic words haunted him, swirling in his mind like a storm he couldn't outrun. "The past isn't finished with you. Only then will you find peace." What did that even mean? How could they know so much about him? He had spent years trying to move on from the wreckage of his past. His sister's death, the grief, the guilt. He had buried it all beneath the surface, hoping it would stay buried. But the twins had unearthed something he wasn't ready to face. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Keanu tried to go through the motions, pretending that everything was normal, but his mind was far away, still in that cafe, still grappling with the eerie presence of the girls. They hadn't just come to him, They had come with a purpose. He couldn't shake the feeling that their appearance was no accident. They were a message, but what was the message? By the time he arrived back home, the house felt strangely empty. Despite its vast size, it was always quiet. It had been a long time since he'd truly felt at home in this place, and the emptiness echoed louder now. Keanu dropped his keys on the table and slumped into the couch. His thoughts drifted back to the night Emma died. He could still see her face in his mind, the way her eyes had looked just before she was taken from him. He could hear the sound of her laughter, the way she used to tease him when they were kids. She had been his anchor, his reason to keep moving forward. And then, just like that, she was gone. The pain of losing her had almost broken him. It was hard enough losing anyone you loved, but Emma had been more than a sister. She had been his best friend, his confidant. The loss wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual. It felt like a part of him had been ripped away. For the longest time, he hadn't known how to cope. Grief had taken its toll on him in ways he couldn't even explain. Some nights, he would sit in the dark, waiting for the pain to subside, but it never did. It just lingered, gnawing at him from the inside out. The more he tried to bury it, the more it consumed him. The twins' words reverberated in his mind again. "You've been hiding from the truth for too long." Was that it? Was the truth he was running from the grief, the pain, his inability to let go of Emma? Was it time to face it all? Every wound, every regret, every tear he had hidden away? Keanu's chest tightened as he stood up from the couch. He didn't know if he was ready for that kind of confrontation, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't have a choice. The past wasn't finished with him, and if he didn't confront it now, he would never be free. The room felt suffocating. He couldn't stay here any longer. Not like this. Not with all the memories weighing him down. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, the urgency of his need to escape pressing at him from all sides. Outside, the city was alive with movement. Cars honked, people rushed by on the sidewalks, lost in their own worlds. It was the usual chaos of Los Angeles, but Keanu felt detached from it all. He wasn't really part of this world anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. His feet took him to the pier by the ocean, a place he often visited when he needed to think. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks had always had a calming effect on him. It was as if the ocean could wash away all the noise, all the clutter in his mind, and offer him a moment of peace. Keanu leaned against the railing, staring out at the vast expanse of water. The cool breeze from the ocean brushed against his skin, and for a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes, breathing in the salty air. He had always found solace in the sea, but today it felt different. The waves seemed to carry the weight of everything he had been trying to avoid. For the first time in years, Keanu allowed himself to feel the full force of his grief. He thought about Emma, her smile, her laugh, the way she had always been there for him. He thought about the phone call he'd received that night, the call that had shattered his world. The waves crashed relentlessly against the shore, as if echoing the turmoil inside him. The pain was still there, raw and unrelenting. But as he stood there, looking out at the endless ocean, something shifted inside him. The pain didn't feel quite as suffocating anymore. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't alone in it. He had spent so much time in isolation, but now, in the presence of the ocean and the memory of his sister, he felt something else, something he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't running anymore. Keanu didn't know how long he stood there, lost in his thoughts, but eventually, the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. As the last light of day disappeared behind the horizon, Keanu finally turned away from the ocean. He had spent enough time avoiding the truth. Now, it was time to face it head-on. But he knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. The twins had given him a glimpse of something larger than himself, a path that he wasn't sure he was ready to walk. They had hinted at answers, but those answers were locked away, and the key was somewhere deep within himself. Keanu made his way back to his car, the weight of the past still heavy on his chest. The night had fallen, and the world around him seemed to have quieted down. As he drove home, the streets were empty, the headlights of his car cutting through the darkness like a small beacon in the void. He wasn't sure what was waiting for him at the end of this journey, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep running anymore. The truth was waiting, and it was time to confront it. Keanu had always prided himself on being someone who could handle life's challenges, someone who could maintain a sense of control even in the most chaotic of situations. But as he sat in his car, staring out at the dimly lit street outside his home, he knew that the encounter with the twins was unlike anything he had ever faced. It wasn't just about the strange visit or the cryptic words they'd spoken. No, it was something deeper, something buried within himself that had suddenly resurfaced, unwilling to be ignored any longer. He had tried for years to suppress the memories of his sister, Emma, the grief, the guilt, the feeling of helplessness that had haunted him since her death. But now, it was like the past was clawing its way to the surface, demanding to be seen, demanding to be understood. And the twins, they were the catalyst for all of it. They had awakened something inside him that he couldn't easily dismiss. Keanu knew he needed answers, but where could he find them? He had no idea what the twins had meant when they said, "The past isn't finished with you." What could they possibly know that he didn't? And what kind of help could two little girls offer him in confronting his grief? The quiet hum of the engine filled the car, and Keanu let out a long sigh. He had no choice but to confront this, but he didn't know where to start. He couldn't continue living like this, stuck in a loop of unresolved pain and confusion. He needed to break free, find some way to move forward, to heal. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his longtime friend, and the person he trusted most in the world, John Wick. "John, you good, Keanu? You've been off the grid a bit lately. Want to meet up?" Keanu smiled softly. John had always been there for him, even when he didn't want anyone around. The two had been through so much together, especially after Emma's death. John was one of the few people who knew the real Keanu, the one who struggled with the pain he kept hidden from the world. John raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. Keanu could tell his friend was listening intently, processing the words before reacting. "They told me the past isn't finished with me, that I've been hiding from the truth for too long. And I don't know what to make of it, but I can't stop thinking about it," Keanu continued, his voice tight with emotion. "They seem to know everything. It's like they were speaking directly to my pain, to the grief I've buried for so long." John's expression softened, and he leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "You've been through a lot, Keanu. We both have. But you've never been the kind of guy to face things head-on, have you? You've always kept it locked away. It's what you do, bury it, move on, focus on work. But maybe now it's time to let it out. Maybe that's why those girls came to you." Keanu's mind raced as he absorbed John's words. He wasn't wrong. He had spent years compartmentalizing his grief, his guilt. He thought he had mastered the art of pushing it all down, burying it so deep that it couldn't hurt him anymore. But now, the past had come knocking, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Keanu admitted quietly, his eyes dropping to the table. "The pain, the memories, it feels like if I let it all in again, I won't be able to handle it. I've barely been holding it together as it is." John's eyes softened with understanding. "You don't have to do it alone, Keanu. You've got me. You've got people who care about you. It's okay to let it out. It's okay to feel that pain. You don't have to carry it forever." Keanu looked up at his friend, gratitude and vulnerability flashing in his eyes. He knew John meant every word, but it was still hard to believe. He had built so many walls around himself over the years, walls that now felt fragile and precarious. The conversation drifted into silence for a moment, both men lost in their thoughts. Keanu stirred his drink absently, his mind still reeling from the twins' visit. What did they want from him? Why had they come to him? And what was the truth he had been hiding from all this time? It was clear to Keanu now. He couldn't move forward until he faced the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how difficult. "I need to go back," Keanu said, suddenly standing up from the booth, a sense of resolve settling in his chest. "I need to find the answers. I can't keep running from this." John didn't stop him, but he stood as well, placing a hand on Keanu's shoulder. "I'm with you, man. Whatever you need." Keanu nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude for the first time in days. Maybe, just maybe, with John by his side, he could finally face the darkness that had been following him all these years. He stepped outside, the cool night air greeting him as he made his way back to the car. The city around him was alive, but Keanu felt as though he were in a world of his own. He knew what he had to do now. The past wasn't finished with him. It was time to open the door he had closed so long ago and see what lay hidden behind it. Keanu didn't know where the journey would lead him, but he knew one thing for sure. It had to start somewhere. The weight of his decision hung heavily around him as he drove through the dark streets of Los Angeles, the city that had both given him everything and taken away so much. His car hummed steadily as he made his way toward a place he hadn't visited in years, the old house he had grown up in. It felt strange to be back, and yet, in some deep corner of his mind, he knew this was where it all began. The house wasn't far from where he currently lived, but it felt like a world away. A different time, a different life. As he pulled up to the driveway, Keanu parked and sat still for a moment, staring at the house. The memories came rushing back to him, each one like a whisper in the back of his mind. He had avoided this place for so long, afraid to confront what was hidden within its walls. But now, it was clear. There was no escaping it. Keanu stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. The house was still the same, quiet, a little worn down, but somehow familiar. He could almost hear Emma's laughter echoing through the halls, see her running through the rooms, her face full of mischief. The ghosts of his past were here, waiting for him, but this time, he wasn't afraid. He couldn't afford to be. He rang the doorbell, unsure if anyone would be home. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 50s, her hair silvering at the temples. She looked at him, a mixture of surprise and recognition crossing her face. "Keanu? Is that really you?" Her voice was soft but filled with warmth. Keanu nodded, giving her a small smile. "It's me, Mrs. Hartman. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Mrs. Hartman had been the family's neighbor for years, and she had always been like a second mother to him and Emma. The years had changed her, but there was still something comforting about her presence. "No, not at all, Mrs. Hartman said, stepping aside to let him in. "It's been so long. Please, come in. It's good to see you." Keanu stepped inside, and the familiar scent of the house, old wood and faint traces of vanilla, hit him. He stood there for a moment, taking it all in, before following Mrs. Hartman into the living room. Sit, she urged, gesturing to the couch. "I'll make us some tea." Keanu sat down, his hands resting nervously on his lap. It was strange to be back here, but he knew he couldn't avoid the past any longer. He had come for a reason. Mrs. Hartman returned with 2 mugs of steaming tea and sat down beside him. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with unspoken understanding. "I know why you're here, Keanu," Mrs. Hartman said gently, her eyes soft but piercing. "You've been carrying a heavy burden, haven't you?" Keanu looked at her, his heart pounding. He had never really talked about his grief with anyone. Not with John, not with anyone. But there was something about Mrs. Hartman, the way she had always been a steady presence in his life, that made him feel like he could finally open up. "I don't know where to start," Keanu admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so many years trying to forget, trying to move on. But lately, it feels like the past is coming for me. The twins, they spoke to me, and I can't stop thinking about what they said. I've been hiding from the truth, but now I don't know if I can keep running." Mrs. Hartman took a slow sip of her tea before speaking again. "You don't have to keep running, Keanu. You're not the first person to try and bury their pain. But you can't outrun what's inside you. It will catch up, one way or another." Keanu stared into his tea, the words sinking in deeper than he expected. "I don't know how to face it. I've been so afraid to let go of the past," Keanu whispered, barely able to believe the words coming out of his mouth. "But maybe it's time." Mrs. Hartman smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "I think it's more than time, Keanu. It's necessary, and you're stronger than you realize." Just then, Keanu noticed something on the mantel, a small wooden box that had never been there before. It was plain but sturdy, with intricate carvings etched into the surface. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized it. It was a memory box, something he and Emma had used when they were children. That box! Keanu's voice trembled as he pointed to it. Mrs. Hartman's gaze softened. That's yours, Keanu. It's been here since the day you left. I've kept it safe for you. Keanu felt a lump form in his throat. It had been years since he'd thought about the box, but now, as he looked at it, he could feel the flood of memories coming back. The box held fragments of his childhood, mementos of a life he had long since buried. And perhaps, inside it, there were pieces of himself that he had left behind. Without another word, Mrs. Hartman got up and handed the box to him. Keanu took it with trembling hands, his heart racing. He opened it slowly, the creaking of the lid sounding louder in the silence of the room. Inside, he found a collection of items, old photographs, a faded ticket stub from a concert he and Emma had attended, and a letter. The letter was addressed to him. With trembling fingers, Keanu unfolded the yellowed paper and began to read. It was from Emma, written just before her death. Her words filled the page with love, but also with a haunting sense of foreboding. Keanu, no matter where life takes us, remember that you are never alone. Don't forget the moments we shared, the laughter, the dreams. And when you find yourself lost, know that I'm always with you. I'll be there, even when you can't see me. Keanu's vision blurred as tears welled in his eyes. The past, the grief, the guilt. All of it had been waiting here, in this box, in these words. He closed the letter and held it to his chest, allowing the flood of emotions to wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. A glimmer of peace, a promise of healing. And as he sat there, surrounded by the pieces of his past, Keanu realized that the truth was already here. All he had to do was open his heart and let it in. Keanu sat silently, the memory box still in his lap, his fingers trembling as they lightly traced the edge of Emma's letter. The words she had written, words he had never known existed until now, echoed in his mind, stirring something deep within him. It was as though Emma had been reaching out from the past, urging him to let go of his guilt, to stop punishing himself for something beyond his control. The house felt strangely still, the air thick with the weight of his emotions. Mrs. Hartman had quietly stepped out of the room, giving him the space he needed to process everything. But the silence only deepened the turmoil inside him. The flood of memories was overwhelming. He could hear Emma's laugh, see her bright eyes full of life, her voice calling his name when they played in the backyard. And yet, her absence, a hole so deep in his heart, seemed louder than anything else. He closed the box and placed it carefully on the coffee table in front of him, his eyes lingering on the carved wooden surface. He realized then that the box wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a key to the past, to the truth that he had been running from all these years. Keanu let out a heavy sigh. I can't keep running from this, he muttered to himself, his voice breaking the silence. The words he had spoken to Mrs. Hartman earlier had felt like a decision, but now, sitting in the quiet of his childhood home, it was becoming a reality. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next. The guilt, the grief, it was too much to carry on his own. But he knew he couldn't face it alone forever. He needed to uncover the truth, to understand what had really happened with Emma. And to do that, he would need help. Keanu thought back to the twins, their cryptic visit, their strange ability to speak to the parts of him that he had buried deep inside. They had hinted at something. They had known things that no one else could have known. Maybe they can help me, Keanu whispered. With a renewed sense of determination, he stood up, his mind already racing. He had to find them. He didn't know where they had come from or how they knew about his past, but he felt a strange pull to them, as if they held the answers he needed. Keanu grabbed his phone and sent a quick message to John. I need your help. I'm going after the twins. He didn't wait for a response. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back now. A few hours later, Keanu and John stood on the sidewalk in front of a small, nondescript house on the outskirts of the city. The address Keanu had received from the twins was now staring him in the face. The house was old and weathered, with faded paint and overgrown ivy creeping up its walls. It didn't look like much, but something about it felt significant, as though this was the place where everything would change. John looked at Keanu, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure about this?" Keanu nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I have to do this, John. They know something I don't. They know about Emma, about everything I've been running from." John studied him for a moment before letting out a heavy sigh. "All right, but if things get weird, we're leaving. No questions." Keanu smiled faintly. "Agreed." The two of them walked up to the front door, which stood ajar, as if they had been expected. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest, each step heavier than the last. When they reached the door, Keanu knocked softly, and the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway were the twins, Maya and Layla. Their eyes were wide and expectant, as if they had been waiting for him all along. "You came," Maya said, her voice soft but steady. "We knew you would," Layla added, her gaze piercing, as if she could see into his very soul. Keanu's throat tightened. I need to understand. What do you know about Emma? Why did you come to me?" The twins exchanged a knowing glance, then stepped aside to allow them to enter. The inside of the house was dimly lit, with a faint smell of incense in the air. It felt like stepping into another world, one that was disconnected from time and space, where the rules of reality didn't seem to apply. Keanu's eyes scanned the room, which was sparsely decorated but filled with strange symbols and artifacts that seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't quite explain. The twins motioned for them to sit on the worn couch in the center of the room, and Keanu hesitated for a moment before following their lead. Maya spoke first. "Keanu, the past is not finished with you. It never was. You've carried its weight for so long that you can't see clearly anymore. But we can help you. We can show you what you've been missing." Keanu leaned forward, desperate for answers. "What do you mean? What do I need to see?" Layla's gaze softened. "You have the truth inside you, Keanu. It's been there all along. But you've locked it away because you were too afraid to face it. Too afraid to confront your pain." Maya continued, her voice calm but firm. "You think you failed Emma. You think you weren't there when she needed you most. But that's not the whole truth. There's more. Much more." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What more could there be?" The twins exchanged a look, as if sharing a silent conversation between them. Then, Layla spoke again. "The truth is this. You weren't meant to save Emma. She had her own journey, her own path, and she chose to leave you behind. But you, Keanu, you are not done yet. Your journey is not over." Keanu felt a shiver run down his spine. "So what now? What am I supposed to do?" Maya's voice was almost a whisper. "You must face what you've buried deep inside. You must understand that the grief you carry isn't just for Emma. It's for everything you've never allowed yourself to grieve. The mistakes, the lost time, the part of yourself you've forgotten." Keanu sat back, his mind spinning. The words were overwhelming, but in some strange way, they felt like the missing pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known he was trying to solve. "There's one more thing," Layla said, her eyes suddenly serious. "You have to let go of the past, Keanu. It's the only way forward. And once you do, you'll find something waiting for you on the other side." Keanu swallowed hard. "What's waiting for me?" Maya and Layla shared another silent glance. Then, together, they spoke the words that would change everything: a new beginning. Keanu sat in stunned silence, absorbing the twins' words, but they felt more like a riddle than a revelation. A new beginning? How could he possibly start over when his entire life seemed to be defined by the mistakes he couldn't undo? Emma's absence, his own feelings of guilt. It all weighed so heavily on him that even the idea of a fresh start seemed impossible. Yet, something about the twins' presence made him wonder if there was truth in their cryptic words. Maya and Layla watched him closely, their expressions unreadable, as if they knew something he didn't. Their silence lingered, stretching the space between them all, but Keanu could no longer ignore the pull he felt to follow their lead. "Okay," Keanu said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but firm. "Tell me what I need to do. How do I find this new beginning?" Layla's smile was almost imperceptible. You already know the way, Keanu. The question isn't whether you can find the path. The question is whether you're ready to take the first step. Keanu felt a pang of uncertainty. The weight of his past was heavy on his shoulders, a burden he wasn't sure he could shed. But in that moment, he realized the truth. He didn't have the luxury of running anymore. If he wanted peace, if he wanted to break free from the grief that held him hostage, he had to confront the past. All of it. We can help you, Maya continued, her voice soft but steady. But you have to be willing to open your heart, to face everything you've been hiding from. Keanu nodded slowly, his hands resting nervously on his knees. I'm ready. Good, Layla said. Because the first step is remembering what you've forgotten. The twins led Keanu through the house to a small room at the back, dimly lit and filled with old books and objects he didn't recognize. The air in the room felt charged, as though the very space was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Maya gestured to an ornate wooden chair in the center of the room. Sit here, she said. We'll guide you. Keanu hesitated only for a moment before sitting down in the chair, feeling an odd mix of curiosity and apprehension. The twins stood before him, their eyes unwavering. They had a calmness about them that contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside him, and yet, somehow, it made him feel safe. Like they knew what he was going through, what he had been through. Close your eyes, Layla instructed, her voice soothing and melodic. Keanu complied, his breath steadying as the world around him seemed to fade away. The room, the house, the city, all of it seemed to vanish as he focused inward. He didn't know what he was supposed to be feeling, but something in the air seemed to shift, like the veil between his present self and his past was thinning. Remember, Maya whispered, go back to the beginning, to the moment when everything changed. Keanu's heart skipped a beat as a flood of memories rushed to the surface. He was no longer sitting in the dimly lit room. He was a child again, standing in front of his old house, the sun setting behind it. He could feel the warmth of the summer air, hear the laughter of Emma as she called to him from the backyard. Everything felt so vivid, so real. He closed his eyes tighter, trying to hold on to the memory. He could see Emma's face, her bright, mischievous grin, her dark eyes full of life. They had been inseparable. That's what he remembered most about those days. How the two of them had shared everything, even their secrets. But then came the shift. The memory flickered, and the warmth of the day was replaced by a cold, sharp feeling of loss. Emma's laughter turned into a soft cry, and Keanu saw her face, twisted in pain, her eyes wide with fear. He reached out for her, but something held him back, something invisible, but undeniable. He tried to run to her, but his legs wouldn't move. A voice whispered in his ear, "You weren't there when she needed you. You weren't fast enough." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Keanu could feel the guilt rising in his chest like a tidal wave, drowning him in regret. He struggled against the feeling, but it was too strong, too overwhelming. He wanted to scream, but no sound came from his throat. Suddenly, the voice stopped, replaced by another one, softer and warmer. "It's not your fault." Keanu opened his eyes, gasping for air. He was back in the room with Maya and Layla, his heart racing in his chest. The twins stood before him, watching him with knowing expressions. "What just happened?" Keanu asked, his voice shaking. "You saw it," Maya said gently. "You saw the truth, Keanu. You weren't there when Emma needed you. But that wasn't your fault. You were a child, too. You couldn't have known what was happening. But the guilt you've carried, it's not yours to hold on to anymore." Keanu swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the vision he had just experienced. It had felt so real, like he had actually been there, in that moment with Emma. And yet, there was something in the second voice that had soothed him, something that told him it wasn't too late to make peace. Layla stepped forward, her eyes compassionate. "The pain you've been holding on to, it's part of your past, but it doesn't have to define your future. You have to forgive yourself, Keanu. Only then can you truly begin to heal." Keanu's mind was spinning, but he felt a small sense of relief, as though the weight on his chest had lessened, even if just slightly. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely lost. There was a path forward, a way out of the darkness. "Forgive myself," he whispered, tasting the words on his tongue. It sounded so simple, and yet he knew it was the hardest thing he would ever have to do. "You're not alone in this," Maya said softly. "Remember that." Keanu nodded, the overwhelming sense of guilt that had consumed him for so long beginning to loosen its grip. It wasn't gone, but maybe, just maybe, he could begin to move past it. Later that evening, Keanu stood outside the twins' house, the weight of the experience still fresh in his mind. The sky above him was dark, but the stars shone brightly, as if guiding him forward. John was waiting by the car, his eyes questioning. "How'd it go?" he asked. Keanu met his gaze, a small, tentative smile tugging at his lips. "I think I'm finally starting to understand." John raised an eyebrow. "Understand what?" Keanu glanced up at the stars. "That the past doesn't have to control me. And that forgiveness, starting with myself, might just be the key to moving forward." John nodded, his expression softening. "That sounds like a good start." Keanu took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in years. "It's more than a start, John. It's the first step toward a new beginning." Keanu's heart felt lighter than it had in years as he drove away from the twins' house, the faint hum of the engine almost drowned out by the rush of thoughts in his mind. The road ahead was dark, but the stars above seemed to whisper that perhaps, for the first time in a long while, there was hope. A glimmer of something more. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew deep inside that the shift had already begun. John sat beside him in silence, his gaze fixed out the window, but Keanu could tell his friend was deep in thought as well. "What do you think happened back there?" John asked finally, breaking the stillness. Keanu didn't immediately respond. The words the twins had shared with him, their cryptic messages about forgiveness, about letting go of the past, still echoed in his mind. It was so much to take in, yet, somehow, it felt like everything had been building up to this moment. "I think," Keanu began slowly, his voice quieter than usual, "I've been carrying something for too long. Something that wasn't even mine to carry." John glanced at him, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Keanu's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "The guilt. The belief that I wasn't there for Emma when she needed me most. That I failed her." John was silent for a moment, letting the weight of Keanu's words settle between them. "And what did you learn tonight?" "I learned that maybe I didn't fail her at all." Keanu's voice cracked slightly as he spoke the words. It felt strange to say them aloud, as if something had shifted inside him with the simple acknowledgement. "The guilt, it was mine, but it wasn't my fault." John nodded slowly, his eyes still focused on the road. "Sounds like a big realization." Keanu gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Yeah, it is. But it's also just the beginning. I still have a lot to figure out. I don't know how to make peace with everything yet, but I'm going to try." "Good," John said, a note of approval in his voice. "It's a start, and that's all you can ask for." Keanu glanced at his friend, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks, John, for sticking by me." John chuckled. "You don't get rid of me that easily, man." As they continued driving, Keanu felt a flicker of hope spark within him, a sense that, maybe, just maybe, he was on the path to something better. But there was still so much to do, so much to face. The next few days passed in a blur. Keanu spent much of his time processing the experience with the twins, trying to make sense of the visions and the revelations that had come to him. The memories of Emma, the guilt, the feeling of being trapped in the past. It all seemed to swirl around him in a chaotic haze. But there was one thing he knew for certain now. He had to face the truth of what had happened, and that meant confronting the people who were part of that truth. Keanu hadn't spoken to his family in years, not since the day of Emma's accident. The rift between them had formed the moment Emma had left, a barrier he'd built up out of pain and anger. But if he was going to move forward, he knew he couldn't leave the past unresolved. Not anymore. It was time to make amends. That afternoon, Keanu found himself standing in front of his childhood home again, staring up at the house that had once been a place of comfort, of laughter, of family. Now, it felt like a distant memory, a relic of a past he wasn't sure he was ready to revisit. His palms were clammy as he rang the doorbell. Moments later, the door swung open, and there stood his mother. Older now, her hair touched with silver, but her eyes still held that familiar warmth. She froze for a moment when she saw him, as if unsure whether he was real or a ghost from the past. Keanu? Her voice trembled slightly, but she quickly recovered, a smile tugging at her lips. It's been a long time. Keanu nodded, his throat tight. Yeah, it has. He shifted awkwardly, unsure of where to start. I need to talk. If you have a minute. His mother stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. Of course. Come in. Keanu entered, his heart racing as memories flooded back. He had spent so much time avoiding this house, avoiding his family, that now, in this moment, it felt overwhelming to be back here. His mother led him into the living room, where they both sat on the worn couch, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Keanu, she began, her voice gentle but hesitant. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. After everything that happened, Keanu took a deep breath, the weight of his emotions threatening to overwhelm him again. I've been running for a long time, Mom. Running from the pain. From the guilt. I've been carrying it for years, and I didn't know how to stop. His mother's eyes softened, but there was something else there, something guarded. You don't have to carry it alone, Keanu. None of us do. I didn't feel like I could talk to you, Keanu admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. When his mother reached out, her hand touching his. We've all carried that pain, Keanu. But we've been living with the scars. We've all had our own way of grieving, and I didn't realize how much you were still holding on to. Keanu looked down at her hand on his, the warmth of her touch grounding him in the moment. I thought if I could just push through it, the guilt would go away. But it hasn't. It's just stayed with me, haunting me. And now, I'm realizing that I've been punishing myself for something I couldn't control. His mother squeezed his hand gently. You don't have to do that anymore. You were a child, Keanu. There was nothing you could have done. Keanu's eyes filled with tears as the words sank in. I didn't know how to be there for you. Or for her. I didn't know how to handle it. Neither did I, his mother said softly. But we can heal, Keanu. Together. We don't have to stay stuck in the past. The floodgates opened, and Keanu let the tears fall. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of relief, like a burden had been lifted. There was so much more to face, so much more to do. But in this moment, he felt a spark of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way out of the darkness that had consumed him for so long. Keanu's mind raced as he sat in his mother's living room, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. The tears he had shed were a release, but they had also opened a floodgate of emotions he wasn't sure how to handle. He had spent so many years holding his grief close, convinced that it was all he deserved. But now, in his mother's warm presence, something inside him was starting to crack open. The silence between them felt different now. No longer was it filled with the unspoken resentments and the sharp edge of guilt. Instead, there was a tentative sense of understanding, a bridge slowly being built between them after years of distance. Keanu wiped his eyes, trying to compose himself. He could feel his mother's gaze on him, her presence steady and patient. I never knew how much I hurt you, Mom, Keanu said, his voice breaking slightly. I thought that staying away was easier, that it would somehow make it all better. But it never did. It just made everything worse. His mother gave him a soft, knowing smile. We've all been through so much. But we can't keep living in the past, Keanu. We need to face it together, so we can move forward. I don't know how, Keanu admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. Every time I try, I end up back at the beginning, back with the guilt, the feeling that I wasn't enough, that I wasn't there when Emma needed me most. His mother reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. You were a child, Keanu. You didn't have the tools to understand what was happening, or how to protect her. You were grieving too, and you couldn't possibly have known what to do. None of us did. But I should have been there, Keanu said, shaking his head. I should have done something. And you have carried that weight for so long. But it wasn't your fault. You need to forgive yourself. Keanu let out a shaky breath, the idea of forgiveness still feeling foreign, like a language he didn't quite understand. How do I do that? How do I forgive myself for something I can't change? His mother smiled gently, her eyes warm with empathy. It's not about forgetting, Keanu. It's about accepting that you couldn't have done things differently. And it's about understanding that your love for Emma is what matters most, not the things you wish you could have done. Keanu's chest tightened, and for a moment, he was afraid to let go of the guilt he had carried for so long. It had been his armor, a way to shield himself from the pain. Without it, what would he be left with? What would it mean to truly let go? You have to let her go, Keanu, his mother said quietly, sensing his hesitation. She's at peace now, and she would want you to find peace too. The words hit him like a wave, crashing over him with a force he hadn't expected. Keanu closed his eyes and tried to picture Emma, to remember her face without the shadow of guilt clouding the memory. She had always been so full of life, so full of laughter. He had lost that image for so long, only remembering her in the context of her death. But now, as his mother spoke, he allowed himself to see her again as she had been. Vibrant, carefree, happy. I've been so focused on what I couldn't do that I forgot what I did, Keanu whispered, almost to himself. You loved her, his mother said softly. That's the most important thing. Keanu nodded, a quiet sense of relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first step in the long road to healing. He still didn't know exactly what forgiveness would look like, but he felt a spark of possibility. I'm sorry, Mom, Keanu said, his voice filled with regret. I should have come home sooner. I should have been here for you. You were dealing with your own pain, Keanu. I understand that, his mother replied. But now, you're here. That's all that matters. Keanu swallowed hard, feeling both grateful and overwhelmed. He had spent so much of his life avoiding his family, avoiding the feelings of guilt and shame that clung to him. But now, sitting here with his mother, something was shifting. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he had thought. I think I need to go back and see the twins, Keanu said after a long pause. The idea had been slowly forming in his mind, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to take that step. I'm starting to understand what they were trying to show me, but I don't think I can do this alone. Not anymore. His mother nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. Then go. And remember, Keanu, you don't have to carry everything on your own. Keanu stood up, a sense of clarity settling over him. Thank you, Mom. She smiled softly. I'll always be here for you. As Keanu walked out of the house and back to his car, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real hope. The kind that doesn't feel fragile or temporary, but like something that could actually last. The road to healing wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready to take the next step. And for the first time in years, he wasn't running from the past. Instead, he was facing it head-on. That evening, Keanu returned to the twins' house. He could feel the weight of his decision as he pulled up to their quiet home once again. But this time, there was no hesitation, no doubt. He was ready. Maya and Layla were waiting for him, just as they had been before. But this time, there was something different in their eyes. A recognition, maybe. They had known this moment would come, and now it had. You're back, Layla said simply, her gaze steady. Keanu nodded. I think I understand now. I can't keep holding on to the past. I need to move forward. Maya smiled, her voice calm. That's the first step, Keanu. The hardest one. Keanu let out a deep breath. I've started to forgive myself, and I think it's time to really start living again. Layla's smile softened, and for the first time, Keanu saw a glimpse of something deeper in their eyes. Maybe it was the same hope he had just begun to find within himself. Good, Maya said, her voice filled with warmth. Now, the real journey begins. Keanu took one last, lingering look at the twins before stepping forward, ready to take whatever came next. His heart was lighter, but his path was still long. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. Keanu sat on the porch of the twins' house, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. The sun had long since set, and the sky was an ink-black canvas dotted with stars, each one seemingly more vivid than the last. His mind, however, was far from calm. Though his conversation with his mother had started to lay the foundation for his healing, Keanu knew that the real work was only just beginning. The twins had offered him their wisdom, but now it was up to him to walk the path they had helped illuminate. His guilt, his pain, all the questions that had plagued him for years, they couldn't just be swept away in a moment. It would take time and effort and probably a lot more tears. But he was ready. "Maya, Layla," he called softly, and within moments, the twins appeared on the porch steps, their presence as grounding as always. They both wore expressions of quiet understanding, as if they had been expecting him. "You're here again," Maya said, her voice light but filled with warmth. "That's a good sign." Keanu looked up at her, grateful for her unwavering support. I think I'm ready to hear more. To really understand what you've been trying to show me." Layla gave him a gentle smile. "You're on the right track, Keanu. But there's something important we haven't discussed yet. Something you'll need to face if you truly want to move forward." Keanu's heart picked up its pace. "What do you mean?" Maya and Layla exchanged a brief glance before Maya spoke again. "The truth is, healing isn't just about letting go of guilt or regrets. It's about embracing your own humanity, your imperfections. You can't move forward if you keep seeing yourself as the broken person you've been. You have to see yourself as the person you're becoming." Keanu nodded slowly, processing her words. "I've been so focused on the things I couldn't change that I never thought about who I am now, who I'm trying to be." "Exactly," Layla replied. "The past will always be a part of you, but it doesn't define who you are today. You've been living in the shadow of your past for too long, but now you can choose to step into the light." Keanu swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had always struggled with the concept of self-acceptance. The guilt over Emma's death, the distance between him and his family, the fractured relationships he had walked away from, they had all built up a version of himself that felt unworthy, undeserving of happiness. But hearing Maya and Layla speak, something inside him began to shift. Maybe, just maybe, he had the power to rewrite his story. "What do I do now?" Keanu asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. Layla's eyes sparkled with a quiet confidence. "The first step is to confront your own fears. The fears that have kept you from truly living. You've built walls around yourself for so long because you didn't think you were allowed to be free. Now it's time to tear those walls down." Keanu felt a shiver run through him. He had always been afraid. Afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of facing the parts of himself he didn't like. But the idea of tearing down those walls, of allowing himself to be free, sparked something deep within him. It was terrifying, but exhilarating at the same time. Maya leaned in, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to do it alone, Keanu. We're here, but the real strength comes from you. The willingness to look in the mirror and accept everything you see." "I'm scared," Keanu admitted, his voice low. "What if I don't like what I see?" Layla put a hand on his shoulder, grounding him with her touch. "That's okay. It's okay to be scared. But that fear doesn't have to control you. You're allowed to make mistakes. You're allowed to stumble. What matters is that you keep going." Keanu closed his eyes, the weight of their words sinking deep into his soul. He had spent so many years running from his own reflection, from the parts of himself he couldn't stand. But now, he realized it wasn't about perfection. It was about growth. And growth came from embracing both the good and the bad. I think I'm ready to face it," Keanu said, his voice steadying with a newfound determination. Maya and Layla exchanged a look, and a quiet smile passed between them. "Good," Maya said softly. "That's all we needed to hear." The days that followed were filled with moments of deep introspection. Keanu spent time with his family, starting to repair the relationships that had been broken for so long. He visited his father for the first time in years, a conversation that was both painful and healing. He sat down with his sister, and although the conversation was awkward at first, they slowly began to rebuild the bond that had once been so strong. But it wasn't just about his family. Keanu also began confronting his past in a more personal way. He started journaling, writing down his feelings, his memories, his regrets. At first, the words felt foreign, like he was trying to communicate with a version of himself that didn't quite exist anymore. But over time, the journaling became cathartic. He could feel the weight of his emotions starting to lift as he allowed himself to be vulnerable on paper. One evening, after a long day of reflection, Keanu sat alone on the back porch of the twins' house, his eyes focused on the stars. He was beginning to see them differently, not as distant, unreachable points of light, but as a reminder that there was always something beyond the darkness. There was always something worth striving for. As he sat there, lost in thought, Layla approached him, her presence soft but unmistakable. She sat beside him without a word, the two of them simply sharing the silence for a while. "You've made a lot of progress," Layla said finally, her voice carrying a quiet pride. "I can see it in you, Keanu." Keanu turned to her, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "I feel it too, but it's not over. I still have a long way to go." "That's true," she agreed. "But remember, the journey is just as important as the destination. You're learning who you really are, and that's worth celebrating." Keanu nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'm starting to realize that." Layla smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. "You've always had the strength within you, Keanu. Sometimes, you just need to give yourself permission to see it." Keanu took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. There was still so much ahead of him, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid of the road. He was ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed Keanu's decision to face his past weren't easy, but they were necessary. He had made progress, yes, but every step forward seemed to come with its own set of challenges. The pain of confronting his mistakes, of accepting the things he couldn't change, was still raw. Yet, there was something about it, something almost liberating, about finally letting go of the weight he had carried for so long. But it wasn't just about his family or his guilt anymore. It was about his own sense of self. Keanu had spent years hiding behind the walls he had built around himself, and now, he was starting to take them down, brick by brick. It was exhausting, but he was slowly starting to feel like the person he had always wanted to be, the person he could be. One chilly afternoon, as Keanu sat in the quiet solitude of his car, parked by the edge of a familiar, forgotten beach, he felt an overwhelming sense of nostalgia. The salty air, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. Everything about this place reminded him of the days when life was simpler, when Emma was still alive, when they had spent afternoons here, talking about everything and nothing. The memory of his sister was sharp, vivid. It stung. It always did. But this time, instead of feeling consumed by grief, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The beach had always been their place, the place where they felt free. Keanu stepped out of the car, the cold wind tugging at his jacket, and walked slowly toward the water. He knew that coming back here would stir up old feelings, but he had to do it. He needed to let Emma go, not just in his mind, but in his heart. As he stood there, gazing out at the horizon, a familiar voice echoed in his memory. "Promise me you'll never forget how much I love you, Keanu." The words hit him like a wave, bringing with them the sharp sting of loss. Emma had said those words to him the last time they had spoken before everything had fallen apart. He closed his eyes, trying to recall her face, her smile, the way she had always been there, even when life seemed overwhelming. But the tears didn't come this time. Instead, Keanu felt something else, something that had been buried deep within him for years. He felt her presence, not as a lingering sorrow, but as a love that would always be with him, even if she was no longer physically there. "I promise, Emma," Keanu whispered into the wind. "I'll never forget." Back at the twins' house, the atmosphere was different now. There was a lightness in Keanu's steps, a quiet strength that had begun to emerge from within him. Maya and Layla had both noticed it, of course, but they said nothing. They didn't need to. They could see it in the way he carried himself, in the way his eyes shone with something other than sadness. "You're looking better," Maya said one evening, her voice laced with approval. Keanu smiled faintly, though there was still a touch of sadness that clung to him. I think I'm starting to understand what you meant. I'm not the person I was when I first came here, but I'm also not who I used to be. Layla, ever the quiet observer, watched him from across the room. It's a process, she said softly, as if the words themselves held more weight than anyone could comprehend. Healing doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, and sometimes it feels like the progress you make isn't enough. But it is. Every step forward is worth something. Keanu nodded, his gaze drifting toward the door. He felt that pull again, the one that called him toward something bigger, something he couldn't fully explain, but something he knew he had to chase. He had spent so long running from his past, but now he was learning to face it. And that was the beginning of something far more powerful than he could have ever imagined. I think I need to go to the city, Keanu said, his voice low but steady. There's something I need to do. Maya raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. Do what you need to do, she said. We'll be here when you get back. Keanu took a deep breath, feeling both a sense of relief and trepidation. There was still a part of him that wanted to run, to turn back and hide. But now, more than ever, he understood that his past was not something to be feared. It was something to be embraced, to be understood. I'll come back. I promise. Keanu's journey to the city wasn't a long one, but it felt like a pilgrimage. Every mile felt heavy with anticipation, the pressure of what lay ahead. He wasn't sure what he would find there, but he knew it was something he had to confront. When he arrived, the streets were bustling, the usual city noise filling the air. But Keanu wasn't interested in the chaos around him. He had a single destination in mind, a small, unassuming building tucked away on a quiet street. It had been a long time since he had set foot in this place, but today it felt different. He felt ready. Stepping into the building, Keanu was greeted by the familiar scent of aged wood and old books. He had spent countless hours here in his younger years, lost in the comfort of stories and quiet corners. It was a library, not just any library, but one that had been a sanctuary for him. It had been Emma's favorite place, too. Keanu walked past rows of dusty shelves, his hand grazing the spines of books he hadn't touched in years. He made his way to the back of the library, where an old wooden door stood. With a deep breath, he pushed it open. The room beyond was small and dimly lit, filled with photographs and keepsakes. It was Emma's corner, the place she had always come to escape, to find peace. And now it was his. A soft sob caught in his throat as he looked around the room, his fingers brushing against her things. A book she had loved, a journal she had kept. The memory of her presence lingered in the air, as if she were still there with him. Keanu's heart ached, but this time, it wasn't the kind of ache that dragged him into despair. It was the ache of love, of remembering. I'm here, Emma, he whispered, his voice trembling. I'm finally here. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Keanu has made huge strides, but the journey is still ongoing. How do you deal with the memories of lost loved ones? What has helped you to honor their memory and move forward? The library was quieter than Keanu remembered, its stillness filling the air like a thick fog. He stood in the small room, surrounded by Emma's belongings, trying to make sense of the emotions that were bubbling to the surface. There was a part of him that still couldn't believe she was gone, a part that felt as if he might wake up from this long, painful dream. But Emma's presence, even in the form of these mementos, reminded him that it was real. She was truly gone, and all he had left were the memories. The quiet sobs that had caught in his throat earlier now came in full waves, escaping his chest in deep, shuddering breaths. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a worn leather-bound journal that lay on the desk in front of him, Emma's journal, the one she had written in every day. Keanu had never read it, never allowed himself to, but now, as he stood in this room filled with pieces of her, he felt a deep need to know, to understand. His fingers trembled as he reached for the journal, carefully flipping it open to the first page. The words written in Emma's neat, flowing handwriting were filled with the details of her life, her hopes, her dreams. It was as if she had been writing directly to him all these years, even though she hadn't known he would ever see this. The first entry was dated the day before everything changed. Keanu doesn't know this, but I think he's slipping away. It's like he's already left us, even though he's still here. I can't explain it, but I feel it. I'm so scared of losing him, but I know I need to keep holding on, no matter what. Keanu's breath caught in his throat as he read the words. The pain in them, the fear, was so palpable it felt like it had been written just yesterday. He could see his sister so clearly in those words, her vulnerability, her love, her need for him to stay, for him to be there. I wish I could tell him how much I need him, how much I look up to him, but maybe I'm too late. The weight of those words hit Keanu like a freight train. The guilt he had carried for so long, the feeling that he had failed her, overwhelmed him. He had no idea she had felt that way. He had been so wrapped up in his own grief, his own escape, that he hadn't seen it, hadn't noticed how much his distance had hurt her. His hands shook as he turned the page. The next entry was dated just a week before her death. Keanu is pulling further away. I've tried to talk to him, try to make him see that I need him, but it's like he doesn't hear me anymore. I just want things to be like they used to be, before everything changed, before everything broke. The tears came harder now, his chest constricting as he realized how much pain he had caused his sister, how much he had failed her by not being the brother she needed. He had thought his absence was protecting her, that it was better for her if he stayed away. But he had been wrong. The more he read, the more he understood. He turned another page. I don't know if I can do this alone. I feel so lost. But I'm not going to give up. I know Keanu loves me. I know he does. I just hope that one day, he'll come back to me. Keanu sat down heavily in the chair beside the desk, the journal slipping from his hands to rest on his lap. He didn't even notice that the room around him had grown darker, or that the faint sound of the ocean waves outside had quieted. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. He had been so consumed with his own pain, so blinded by his guilt and fear, that he hadn't seen Emma's suffering. He hadn't seen how much she had needed him, how much she had always needed him. He closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair, a deep ache spreading through his chest. He had never imagined that this journal would reveal so much. It was like a mirror, reflecting back the version of himself that he had long denied, the version of himself that he could have been if he hadn't been so afraid. I'm so sorry, Emma, he whispered, the words barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to leave you. I'll never forgive myself for that, but I'll try. I'll try to be the person you wanted me to be. It felt like a promise, to her, to himself. Keanu wasn't sure how long he sat there, lost in the weight of Emma's words and his own guilt. But when he opened his eyes again, the room felt different. The air felt thicker, as though the past had come alive in the space around him. For the first time, Keanu felt the full force of the love he had for Emma, and the painful understanding that love couldn't change the past. Still, it was a start. When Keanu finally left the library, the city around him seemed to have changed. It felt quieter somehow, as though the hustle and bustle of life couldn't quite touch him anymore. He had come to the city searching for answers, but what he had found instead was a deeper question. Who was he now? Who could he become if he allowed himself to accept his flaws, to forgive himself? The road ahead was still uncertain. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew that the journey wouldn't be easy. But as he walked away from the library, the journal tucked securely under his arm, Keanu felt something shift inside of him. Something light. Something that told him he was moving toward the person he was always meant to be. Back at the twins' house, Keanu found Maya and Layla sitting on the porch. The moment they saw him, they both rose to their feet, their faces showing the quiet acknowledgement of the progress they had seen in him. Keanu gave them a faint smile as he walked toward them, his eyes carrying a new kind of determination. I think I understand now. I understand what I need to do, for myself, for Emma. Maya nodded, her eyes soft with approval. You're finding your way, Keanu. It's all part of the process. Layla's gaze was steady, her voice calm but certain. The hardest part is accepting who you were, and then deciding who you want to be. You're on your way. Keanu took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, feeling as if the weight of the world had been lifted, even just a little. There was still work to be done, still pieces of himself to put back together. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. Keanu's return to the twins' house was quiet, but there was a shift in him, a subtle yet undeniable change. The heavy burden that had clung to him for years seemed lighter, if only by a fraction. The weight of his guilt wasn't gone, but for the first time, he understood that it was something he had to carry. Not as a punishment, but as a reminder of the love that still tied him to his past. Maya and Layla sensed it the moment he stepped through the door. The air was still, but there was a new energy that filled the space, one that hadn't been there before. Maya studied him for a moment, a small smile curving her lips as she poured herself a cup of tea. "Look at you," she said softly, her eyes reflecting a knowing warmth. "I can see it. You're lighter, Keanu. It's like you've shed a layer of skin." Keanu hesitated for a moment, then gave a half-laugh, the sound still edged with uncertainty. "I don't know if I'm lighter yet, but I feel different. I guess that's a start." Layla was sitting by the window, her eyes fixed on the street outside, but she spoke without turning to look at him. "You're walking a different path now, one where you can finally see the road ahead, even if it's not clear." Keanu glanced at her, appreciating her quiet insight. He had always found comfort in the twins' words, their ability to see through the layers and into the heart of things. But it wasn't just their support that had helped him get here. It was the painful journey he had gone on by himself, the one that led him to Emma's journal, the one that forced him to face his guilt, and, most importantly, the one that showed him that healing wasn't about perfection. It was about understanding and acceptance. "I'm ready to move forward," he said, his voice steady. "But I don't know what that looks like yet." Maya looked at him with a gentle expression, her tone thoughtful. "It's okay not to know. Sometimes the journey itself is more important than the destination. You don't have to have everything figured out." Keanu took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest. She was right. He didn't need all the answers. He didn't even need to have a plan. What mattered was that he had the courage to keep moving, to keep searching for what lay ahead. But there was still one thing that nagged at him, one question that he couldn't shake. His sister's death, the way it had all unfolded. Keanu had spent so many years blaming himself, but had he ever truly understood what had happened? What had really caused her to spiral into the darkness that had consumed her in the end? The idea had been gnawing at him for weeks, and now that he had come this far, he realized that it was time to confront it. The truth. The part of him that still couldn't accept it. It was time to look deeper. "I need to go back," Keanu said, his voice quiet but firm. "I need to find out what really happened. I need to understand why Emma was struggling so much, and why I couldn't see it." Maya and Layla exchanged a look, their expressions serious. They had both known that this moment would come. Keanu's journey to heal wasn't just about accepting his past. It was about finding the truth that had been buried under years of confusion and guilt. Layla finally spoke, her voice steady as always. "The truth will set you free, Keanu, but it might also hurt. Are you ready for that?" Keanu swallowed, his throat dry. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he had to be. He had spent too long running from it. And now, he had to face it, the last part of his journey to healing. "I have to," he said, almost to himself. "I can't move forward until I do." The next morning, Keanu found himself on a familiar road. The drive to the old house, the one Emma had once called home, was long, the landscape shifting around him as he moved further away from the comforting embrace of the twins' house. The tension in his chest grew with every mile he passed. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, most of them filled with doubt. What would he find? Was this the right thing to do? By the time he reached the house, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the world in a soft, golden glow. The house stood just as it had all those years ago, weathered, quiet, a silent witness to all that had unfolded here. Keanu stood in front of the door for a long time, hesitating. His hand hovered over the door handle, but it felt like it was the heaviest thing in the world. He had no idea what he was walking into. Finally, he pushed open the door, and the smell of dust and old wood filled his nose. The house was empty, eerily so, but it wasn't unfamiliar. He had spent so many nights here, laughing with Emma, the two of them sharing stories and dreams. Now, it felt like a ghost town. Everything was still, as if time had stood still since he had last been here. Keanu stepped inside and let the memories wash over him. The old kitchen table where they had spent hours talking. The worn couch where they had cuddled while watching movies. Every inch of this place held a piece of Emma. And yet, there was one room in particular that he couldn't bring himself to enter. The room that had been Emma's sanctuary. The room where she had spent her last days. The place where everything had spiraled out of control. It was time. Time to face it. Keanu made his way to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment he stepped inside, he was hit by a wave of memories. Emma's clothes, her books, her scattered journals. It was as if she had never left. But in the corner of the room, there was something else. Something he hadn't expected. A box. A box filled with letters. His fingers trembled as he reached for the box and opened it. The letters inside were addressed to him, and his breath caught in his throat as he recognized Emma's handwriting. Keanu sat down on the floor, surrounded by the letters, and began to read. Keanu, I don't know how to say this. I don't know what happened to us, but I need you to know that I love you. Always. Even when I didn't seem like myself, even when things were falling apart, you were the one person I needed. The words seemed to echo in the silence of the room, and for the first time, Keanu understood. He understood the weight of her pain, the depth of her love, and the sadness that had followed her. This wasn't just a letter of goodbye. It was a plea for him to understand, for him to come back, and for him to forgive himself. The tears came now, without warning, not just for Emma, but for everything that he had been running from, for the brother he could have been. Keanu sat surrounded by the letters, their contents overwhelming him like an ocean tide. Each one was a small piece of Emma's heart, a glimpse into the soul he had never fully understood until now. The tears that had come earlier seemed endless, each one filled with sorrow, guilt, and the weight of realizations he hadn't been ready to face. His mind raced through the years, memories of Emma flashing before his eyes, moments that now felt like fragments of a puzzle he had never been able to put together. The room felt suffocating in its silence, the weight of Emma's absence pressing on him from all sides. The letters were scattered around him, but the one that caught his eye was the last one. It was dated just a few days before her death, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw her familiar handwriting. Keanu, it began. I don't know how to fix what's broken between us. I don't know if I can fix myself, but I need you to know, even though I don't say it enough, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all the times I pushed you away. I thought that if I was quiet enough, if I didn't ask for too much, you'd stay. I thought that maybe if I wasn't such a burden, you'd still love me like you used to. But I've realized that no matter how hard I try to hide it, I'm breaking. Keanu's breath caught in his throat as he read the words. The raw honesty of it, the pain and fear that had seeped into her writing, gripped him tightly. He had been so caught up in his own turmoil, so lost in his own world of guilt and confusion, that he hadn't seen the quiet desperation in her. He hadn't seen the cries for help that were woven into the fabric of her life. I've tried so hard to be strong, Keanu, but I'm so tired, and I don't know what to do anymore. All I want is to be okay again, to be enough. But I'm scared. I'm scared that I'll never be enough for anyone, not even for you. The tears came again, this time more steady, as if they had been waiting to break free all along. Keanu wiped at his eyes, the guilt burning in his chest, mixing with the sadness that he couldn't seem to shake. How had he not seen this? How had he missed the signs of her pain, the quiet cracks in her soul that had grown wider with each passing day? He had been so focused on his own demons that he hadn't noticed hers. Please, Keanu, if you're reading this, know that I love you. I always have. I always will. But I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending. I just need you to understand. I need you to understand that I'm not angry. I'm just so tired. Please forgive me. The last line lingered in the air like a quiet plea, and Keanu's heart shattered as he finished reading it. Forgive her. She was asking him to forgive her, when all along, it was him who had never forgiven himself. He had spent so many years blaming himself for her death, for not being there when she needed him the most. But now, as he sat in this room, surrounded by her words, he realized that forgiveness wasn't something that needed to come from her. It needed to come from him. The guilt that had strangled him for so long started to loosen its grip. Emma hadn't blamed him. She hadn't wanted him to feel this weight. She had wanted him to understand, to forgive himself. And, most importantly, she had wanted him to live without carrying the burden of her pain. Keanu stood up, the letters still in his hands, and walked toward the window. He looked out over the town, the sky now a deep shade of purple as the night settled in. It was quiet, but in the stillness, he could hear Emma's voice in his head, her words echoing in his mind. "I love you. I always have. I always will." And in that moment, Keanu knew that he was ready. Ready to let go of the guilt. Ready to move forward. He didn't know what that would look like yet, but he knew it was time to stop living in the past. He had spent so long hiding from the truth, from his own feelings, but now he was ready to face them head-on. He took a deep breath and walked out of the room, leaving the letters behind. There was nothing more he could do here, nothing more to uncover. What mattered now was what he chose to do with the truth. What mattered now was healing. The drive back to the twins' house was different this time. Keanu felt lighter, as if the burden that had weighed on him for so long had finally begun to lift. He still didn't have all the answers, and he didn't expect to, but he understood now that healing wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about taking the next step, even when the road ahead was unclear. When he arrived, Maya and Layla were waiting for him on the porch, their faces calm but expectant. Keanu stepped out of the car and walked toward them, his heart pounding, but with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. "Keanu," Maya said softly, her eyes searching his, "what did you find?" Keanu smiled, though it was a bittersweet smile. "I found the truth, and I found something I thought I had lost, my ability to forgive myself." Layla's gaze softened, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a hard thing to do, but it's the only thing that will set you free." Keanu nodded, the weight of their words settling in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly free. Not free from the past, but free to move forward, to live a life that wasn't dictated by guilt and fear. "I'm ready to move on," Keanu said, his voice steady. "I'm ready to find peace." Maya and Layla exchanged a look, their faces full of quiet pride. They had watched him struggle, but now they could see the transformation in him. The man before them was different from the one who had walked into their lives months ago. He was more whole, more at peace with himself. Keanu took a deep breath, the weight in his chest lighter than it had ever been. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future would bring. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid to face it. He was ready. Keanu woke the next morning with a sense of calm that had eluded him for years. The weight of guilt, though not entirely gone, felt more like a distant memory. It no longer controlled him, no longer had a hold on his every decision. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was breathing again, like the air around him wasn't just a suffocating reminder of everything he hadn't done. He had spent so many years trapped in a cage of his own making, and now, finally, he could see a way out. But peace didn't come without its challenges. Keanu had come to realize that the hardest part of his journey wasn't the confrontation with his past. It was the journey ahead, the road to redemption, the path where he would learn to make amends and live in a way that honored the memory of Emma. Keanu looked out the window as the morning sun filtered through the trees. He wasn't sure where this new chapter would lead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to walk it. Maya and Layla had both been supportive throughout his emotional journey, offering him wisdom and guidance. Yet, Keanu knew that their role in his life was about more than just comfort. They had become his family, his grounding force, and he was beginning to understand that this new life he was embarking on would require him to give back, not only to them but to the world at large. He had spent so many years focused on his own wounds that he hadn't seen the pain in others. Now, he was determined to make a difference, to live with intention. It started with a phone call. Keanu had reached out to an old friend, someone from his past who had always been there, even when Keanu had been too closed off to appreciate their friendship. It had taken him a while to gather the courage, but he knew it was time. He needed to re-establish those relationships, rebuild the trust he had once taken for granted. The phone rang, and after what felt like an eternity, a familiar voice answered. "Keanu? Is that really you?" Keanu smiled, his heart swelling with relief. It was Sarah, a friend from his college years. She had been a constant presence during the early days of his career and had stuck by him even when he had pushed everyone away. Sarah had been one of the few people who understood his drive, his need to prove himself, and she had been the one to help him when his world fell apart. "Hey, Sarah," Keanu said, his voice soft but steady. "It's been a long time. I can hear it in your voice. You sound different. What's going on?" Keanu took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his next words. He had so much to explain, so many years to make up for, but he knew that he couldn't hide anymore. He had to face it. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Sarah, and I want to apologize. For everything. For not being there when I should have been. For letting everything fall apart. I've been running from myself for so long, and I don't want to do that anymore." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Keanu's heart raced. Had he said too much? Had he crossed a line that he couldn't come back from? Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "Keanu, I'm glad you're saying this. I always knew you were carrying something heavy, but I never knew what. But I've always believed in you, even when you couldn't believe in yourself. I'm just glad you're finally finding your way back." Keanu felt a flood of gratitude wash over him. He had spent so many years thinking that redemption was a distant, unattainable goal. But in this conversation, with Sarah's forgiving words, he realized that redemption wasn't just about seeking forgiveness from others. It was about accepting that he had made mistakes, but he was willing to change, to become better. "Thank you, Sarah," Keanu said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not asking for anything from you. I just want to make things right. I want to be someone you can count on again." Sarah's laugh was light, warm, and full of understanding. "Keanu, I'm not asking for anything either. Just take it one day at a time. You don't have to do it all at once. Just keep moving forward." As Keanu ended the call, he felt a surge of hope, a feeling he hadn't known in years. It was as if the pieces of his life were slowly coming back together, each small act of redemption bringing him closer to the person he was meant to be. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but Keanu finally realized that he could change. He could evolve into someone who wasn't defined by his past mistakes, but by his efforts to do better moving forward. Later that evening, Keanu sat down with Maya and Layla on the porch, the three of them sharing a quiet moment as the sun dipped below the horizon. The twins had always been a source of unwavering support, and now, more than ever, Keanu appreciated their presence in his life. "I spoke to Sarah today," Keanu said, breaking the silence. "I apologized for everything, for not being the friend she needed me to be." Maya smiled gently, her eyes reflecting the fading light of the evening. "And how did it feel?" "It felt like a weight was lifted off my shoulders," Keanu admitted. "I didn't realize how much I had been holding onto until I said the words out loud. But it's more than that. It's not just about saying sorry. It's about showing up. It's about making amends and being the person I should have been all along." Layla's voice, always calm and measured, was soft but full of wisdom. "It's the little things, Keanu. The everyday choices we make that define who we are. It's about doing better, not because we owe anyone something, but because we owe it to ourselves." Keanu nodded, his heart full. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but he no longer felt lost. He didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would. But for the first time, he understood that the journey was just as important as the destination. The sun had completely set now, and the world was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. It was a time for quiet reflection, for taking in the beauty of the moment. Keanu didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Keanu stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection as if searching for the person he used to be, or the person he wanted to become. The man who had been lost in self-blame and guilt for so long seemed so distant now. But who was he now? Who would he choose to be? It felt as though he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the winds of uncertainty swirling around him, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel afraid of the fall. He had spent so much time questioning his worth, measuring his every action against some impossible standard. But the more he reflected on the conversations he'd had with Maya, Layla, and Sarah, the more he realized that redemption didn't require perfection. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about doing better, learning from it, and not allowing it to dictate the future. The road to redemption was not paved with grand gestures. It was in the small, everyday choices, in showing up, in being present, in making amends, and, most importantly, in forgiving oneself. Keanu had learned that the hardest person to forgive was often oneself, but he was learning, slowly, to let go of the chains he had forged from his own shame. The phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Maya. "Hey, Keanu, we've been thinking about doing something different today. We want you to come with us." Keanu chuckled lightly, raising an eyebrow. "Different? What do you have in mind?" "Well, it's a surprise. Just get ready and meet us in about an hour. Trust us, it'll be good for you." Keanu felt a flicker of curiosity, but more than that, he felt a sense of gratitude toward them. They weren't just offering advice or emotional support. They were pulling him out of his own head, encouraging him to live beyond the confines of his past. An hour later, Keanu found himself standing outside the twins' house, his curiosity still piqued. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the world seemed to stretch out before him, full of possibilities. Maya and Layla greeted him at the door with wide smiles, their energy infectious. "You ready for this?" Layla asked, her voice light but serious, as if she knew how important this moment was. "I think so," Keanu replied, unsure of what exactly he was walking into but feeling a sense of calm. Maybe this was part of the healing process, getting out of his comfort zone, embracing the unknown. The twins led him to a nearby park, where the trees were heavy with the colors of fall. It was peaceful, serene, and beautiful in a way that felt almost surreal. As they walked, Keanu noticed that they were heading toward a large, open area with a few benches scattered around. There were a few people walking dogs, others jogging, but most of them were just sitting, enjoying the quiet. "This is where we come when we need to clear our heads," Maya explained, walking beside him. "We thought you could use a place like this, somewhere calm, without expectations." Keanu took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself the luxury of simply being present, of just existing without the constant pressure of expectations. But today, he felt free in a way he hadn't in years. They sat on a bench beneath a large oak tree, and for the first time in a long while, Keanu felt like he wasn't running from something. He was just sitting, existing in the moment. "Sometimes, we all need to pause," Layla said. Her voice as quiet as the rustling of the leaves overhead. "We get so caught up in our heads, in the past, in what we should have done or could have done, that we forget to breathe." Keanu nodded, taking in the peaceful surroundings. He had been running for so long, running from the pain, the guilt, and the fear that had defined his existence. But now, in this moment, he was learning how to simply sit with himself. "Do you ever just feel like you're not enough?" Keanu asked, his voice almost a whisper as he stared out at the horizon. "Like no matter how hard you try, you can never fix things?" Layla and Maya exchanged a glance, and for a moment, Keanu thought they might brush off his question, but they didn't. Instead, Maya leaned forward slightly, her gaze soft and understanding. "We all feel that way sometimes," Maya said quietly, "but feeling like you're not enough doesn't mean you're not worthy. It just means you're human. And that's okay." Keanu took a deep breath, letting her words settle in his chest. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but in the quiet space between their words, he realized something important. He was enough. Not because he had fixed everything, not because he had made up for his past mistakes, but simply because he was trying. Because he was learning to show up, to be vulnerable, and to forgive himself. The realization washed over him like a wave. Not a dramatic shift, but a subtle change. A change in the way he viewed himself, the way he viewed his life. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the park, Keanu felt a shift inside him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he was ready to face it without fear. He had the tools now: self-compassion, the support of people who cared for him, and a willingness to keep moving forward. He looked over at Maya and Layla, who had both fallen into a comfortable silence beside him. They didn't need to say anything else. They had already given him the gift he needed most: permission to be at peace with himself. "Thank you," Keanu said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. Maya and Layla smiled at him, their expressions a mix of warmth and understanding. They didn't need to say anything either. In that moment, words weren't necessary. They had all found what they needed in the stillness, a reminder that healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken, but about learning to live with the cracks and finding peace within them. The days had begun to blur together for Keanu, each one another step toward the healing he had once thought impossible. His mornings now felt different, quieter, yet somehow more fulfilling. He woke without the same weight of guilt on his chest, and though the memories of Emma lingered, they no longer haunted him. Instead, they were fading into something softer, more distant, like the remnants of a storm that had finally passed. But with each step forward, there were still moments of doubt, moments where the old fear crept back in. What if he wasn't enough? What if he couldn't keep moving forward? Keanu knew that healing wasn't linear. Some days, he felt stronger, like he could take on anything. He didn't have to hold on to every mistake, every regret. They didn't define him. It was okay to move on. As he sat there, watching the last light of the day slip behind the horizon, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey he had taken so far. It had been painful, raw, and full of moments where he had questioned everything he thought he knew about himself. But it had also been a journey of growth, a journey that had taught him about resilience, about the power of vulnerability, and about the importance of accepting love, not just from others, but from himself. He heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and soon Maya and Layla appeared, their silhouettes framed by the fading light. Maya smiled at him, a knowing look in her eyes. "You okay?" she asked, sitting beside him. Keanu nodded, feeling the calm wash over him again. "Yeah, I'm better than okay, actually." Layla sat down on his other side, her gaze steady. "You've been working through a lot. I think you're starting to realize that healing isn't about perfection. It's about progress." Keanu looked at them both, the weight of their words sinking in. "It's about learning to be okay with not being perfect, right?" "Exactly," Maya said with a smile. "You don't have to fix everything at once. It's about accepting where you are right now and letting yourself move forward." Keanu took a deep breath, the clarity in his mind feeling like a weight lifting from his chest. He didn't have all the answers. There were still moments when the past would try to pull him back in. But now, he understood that he didn't need to have it all figured out. He just needed to keep moving, one step at a time. For the first time in a long while, Keanu felt like he was standing on solid ground, his feet firmly planted in the present, ready to face whatever came next. The next day, Keanu decided to take another step toward the person he wanted to be, a man who didn't run from his past, but embraced it as part of who he was. He called up his manager, something he hadn't done in a while, and set up a meeting to discuss his career. It wasn't just about the movies anymore. It was about his legacy, what kind of impact he wanted to leave on the world. As he sat in the small office, waiting for the meeting to begin, Keanu found himself thinking back to all the years he had spent so consumed with achieving success that he had neglected the deeper questions: who he was, what he stood for, and how he could use his platform to make a real difference. When his manager walked in, Keanu greeted him with a genuine smile, feeling more present than he had in a long time. "I've been thinking a lot about my next steps," Keanu said, settling into the conversation. "I want to do something different, something that matters." His manager looked at him with interest, clearly surprised by the direction of the conversation. "What do you mean?" "I want to focus on projects that inspire people," Keanu explained. "I want to be part of stories that uplift, that show the value of human connection, healing, and growth. I've spent enough time telling stories that don't really mean anything to me anymore. It's time to tell the ones that do." His manager nodded, clearly impressed with the clarity in Keanu's voice. "That's a big shift, but I can see how important it is to you." Keanu smiled. I've learned a lot in the past few months, and I think it's time I use what I've learned to make a difference. As the meeting continued, Keanu felt a sense of excitement he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about the fame, the accolades, or the recognition. It was about using his platform to tell stories that mattered, to inspire others to heal, to grow, and to believe in the power of change. Later that evening, Keanu returned to the twins' house, the weight in his chest lighter than ever. He sat down with Maya and Layla, sharing the news about his decision to shift his career focus. They both listened intently, their faces full of pride. "We're so proud of you, Keanu," Layla said quietly, her voice full of warmth. "This is exactly what you've needed, to follow your heart, to do what makes you feel alive." Keanu nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had finally found his purpose, not just in his career, but in his life. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't perfect, but he was learning to live authentically. He was learning to embrace his past, let go of the guilt, and move forward with an open heart. Keanu walked through the halls of his home, the house feeling quieter than ever before. It was an odd feeling. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was a reminder that so much had changed. So much had shifted in his life in such a short time. There had been a time when the walls felt suffocating, when the memories seemed to follow him wherever he went. But now, they didn't have the same power over him. He had come to understand that healing wasn't just about reconciling with the past. It was about learning to forgive, not just others, but himself. As Keanu sat on the edge of his bed, his mind wandered back to the last few months. The emotional roller coaster had been exhausting, but every moment, every conversation had led him to this point. He wasn't just moving forward, he was healing. He had avoided talking about it for months, telling himself that he would get around to it when he was ready. But now, he couldn't keep putting it off. He needed to make peace with the past, especially with the one person he had yet to forgive, himself. Keanu took a deep breath and grabbed his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. The voice on the other end picked up after a few rings. "Hello?" Keanu swallowed hard. "Hey, it's Keanu." The voice on the other end was quieter now, but there was no surprise in the response. They had both known this moment would come, though neither had ever dared to speak it aloud. "Keanu, I'm listening," the voice said, the edges of emotion creeping into their tone. Keanu's heart pounded, but this time, he didn't feel the same panic. He wasn't scared to face this conversation anymore. He was ready. "I've spent so many years running from my mistakes. I've blamed you for things that weren't your fault, and I've never really acknowledged the pain I caused you. I was selfish, and I hurt you in ways I can never take back. I'm sorry. I need you to know that I regret everything. Everything that I didn't do, everything I said. I've carried that guilt for so long, and I've been afraid to face it. But I'm ready now. I want to make amends." On the other end of the phone, there was silence. Keanu could feel the weight of their words, the history of everything that had gone unsaid. It was difficult, but this was the first real step toward freeing himself from the chains of regret. "I don't know what to say," the voice responded, softer now. "I've been waiting for this, Keanu, for you to admit what happened, for you to finally see the truth of what we went through together. I've waited for you to own your part in it." "I see it now," Keanu said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't just running from the truth. I was running from myself, and I'm done with that. I don't expect anything from you. I just needed to say this, for my own peace." There was a long pause before the voice on the other end spoke again, quieter now. "I've been angry for a long time, Keanu, but hearing you say this, it matters. It matters to me." Keanu's chest tightened. "I know. I've needed to say it for so long, but I didn't know how to begin. I didn't know if I even had the right to ask for your forgiveness." "You do," came the reply. "You always had the right. We both made mistakes, Keanu, but it's clear you're trying to make things right. That's all I can ask for." Keanu let out a shaky breath, the weight on his shoulders lifting, just a little. "Thank you. That means everything to me." They stayed on the phone a little longer, speaking in softer tones about the past, about the ways they had both grown. There were no grand reconciliations, no promises of fixing everything, But there was something far more important. The acknowledgement that they had both been part of a painful story, and they had both, in their own ways, learned from it. When Keanu hung up the phone, he felt a sense of clarity settle over him. The conversation hadn't erased the past, but it had made him realize something profound. Forgiveness wasn't about fixing everything or making the past disappear. It was about owning the pain, embracing it, and then letting it go. For the first time in a long time, Keanu felt lighter. Later that evening, Keanu met Maya and Layla for dinner. The twins could see the change in him immediately. There was something different about the way he carried himself, something quieter, more assured. "How did it go?" Layla asked gently, her eyes full of understanding. "It went well," Keanu said, his voice calm but full of emotion. "It wasn't easy, but I finally had the conversation I've been avoiding for so long. And I'm free now. Free from the guilt. Free from the regret." Maya smiled softly, a proud smile that reached her eyes. "You did the hardest thing, Keanu. You faced your past and owned it. That's where true healing begins." Keanu nodded, looking at his friends with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you too. You've been my anchors through all of this." Layla's voice was steady, filled with quiet wisdom. "And you've always had it in you, Keanu. You just needed to believe it yourself. Healing doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. But you're on the right path now." Keanu looked around the table at the two women who had helped him see the truth, who had walked with him through every dark moment, and he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't perfect, and he never would be, but he was learning to forgive, to move forward, and to embrace the beauty of each step. Keanu stood at the edge of the park, the cool breeze of early autumn tugging at his jacket. The leaves were beginning to turn, shades of gold and amber breaking through the vibrant green that had once dominated the landscape. It was as if nature itself was signaling the change that had quietly taken place in him over the last several months. He had come to this park many times before, often just to escape the noise in his head. But today, standing there, it felt different. Today, it felt like a place of new beginnings. The phone in his pocket buzzed, and Keanu pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name on the screen. It was Maya. "Hey, Maya," he said, his voice steady but laced with the excitement he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. "Hey, Keanu," she replied, her voice warm. "How are you feeling today?" Keanu looked out across the park, the world around him alive with movement. I think I'm okay. No, I'm more than okay. I feel like I'm finally in the right place, you know? Like everything I've gone through, all the pain, it was leading to this moment." "That's amazing," Maya said, her voice full of pride. "I knew it was in you. You just had to find it yourself." Keanu smiled, feeling a swell of gratitude toward her. "I couldn't have done it without you and Layla. You two helped me see things I couldn't see on my own." Maya's laughter echoed through the phone, light and genuine. "That's what friends are for, Keanu. We're here for the ups and downs." Keanu nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "You're right. And speaking of, I've been thinking a lot about what comes next. I know I've spent so much of my life running from things, from myself, but now I think I'm ready for something different. I'm ready to face life head-on. Not just the parts that are easy, but all of it. The good, the bad, the messy parts." "That sounds like the Keanu I know," Maya said, her voice full of affection. "You're on the right path for sure. So, what's next for you?" Keanu paused, feeling a sense of calm wash over him as he thought about the future. He wasn't sure what it would look like yet, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. I think I'm going to focus on the things that really matter to me," he said slowly, the weight of the words sinking in. "I'm going to keep doing the work, but I also want to invest in my relationships, in the things that bring me joy. I want to focus on the moments that make life worth living." "Sounds like you're ready for the next chapter," Maya said. "You're going to be just fine, Keanu. You've already come so far." Keanu chuckled softly. "I think I'm finally starting to believe that." Before he could say anything else, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned, and there they were, Layla and Maya, walking toward him with wide smiles on their faces. "There you are," Layla called out as they reached him. We've been looking everywhere for you. Keanu laughed, a feeling of lightness bubbling up inside him. I've just been clearing my head, taking everything in. Well, you've been doing a lot of thinking lately, Maya said, nudging him gently. Ready to move forward? Keanu looked between the two of them, his heart full of gratitude. Yeah, I am. I'm ready for whatever comes next. No more running, no more hiding. It's time to live. Layla's smile grew even wider, and she took his hand. That's the spirit. We've got your back always. Keanu squeezed her hand in return. I know, and that means the world to me. As they all walked together through the park, Keanu found himself soaking in the beauty of the world around him. It was like a fresh start, not just for him, but for the friendships he had with Maya and Layla. The three of them had been through so much together, and now they were standing at the threshold of something new, something that felt full of promise. Later that night, Keanu sat on the porch again, staring up at the sky, the stars twinkling brightly above him. He had learned so much over the past few months. He had learned to confront the past, to embrace vulnerability, to heal, and to forgive. But there was one thing he still had to face, the fear of what was yet to come. It wasn't easy to admit, but Keanu knew that as much as he had made progress, there were still moments where doubt would creep in. The old fears, the old insecurities, would always be there, just below the surface. But he also knew that he was stronger now, that he had the tools to face those fears head-on. He wasn't defined by his mistakes anymore. He wasn't defined by the things that had happened to him. He was defined by the choices he made today and the ones he would make tomorrow. And that, he realized, was the most empowering thing of all. The next morning, Keanu woke up with a new sense of purpose. He didn't know exactly where his journey would take him, but he felt ready. There were still many things to learn, many challenges to face, but for the first time in years, he was eager to face them. With a heart open to change and a mind focused on growth, Keanu stepped into his future, no longer weighed down by the past. As he walked into the kitchen, the smell of coffee filled the air. Layla and Maya were already there, chatting and laughing. The three of them exchanged smiles, their bond stronger than ever before. We're in this together, right? Keanu said, looking at them both. Maya raised her coffee cup, her eyes bright. Always. Forever, Layla added, giving him a wink. And for the first time in a long time, Keanu truly believed it. The future was uncertain, but with the support of the people who mattered most, he knew he could handle whatever came next, one step at a time. Together, Keanu walked into the coffee shop, a familiar sense of comfort wrapping around him as he stepped inside. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the soft hum of quiet conversations, and the rhythmic tapping of laptops filled the air. This had always been his favorite place to think, to reflect, to ground himself when the world felt too overwhelming. But today, there was something different about it. Today, Keanu wasn't just here to escape the noise. He was here to confront something he hadn't fully acknowledged yet. Sitting at a corner table was a figure he hadn't expected to see, his old friend, Daniel. They hadn't spoken in years, not after the fallout that had ended their friendship so abruptly. Keanu had often wondered what had happened to Daniel, where he had gone, and if there was any chance of rekindling what they once had. As Keanu approached the table, Daniel looked up, his eyes meeting Keanu's with a mixture of surprise and hesitation. The years apart had left both men changed, scars of the past etched into their faces. But despite everything, Keanu felt a sense of calm wash over him. This wasn't about the past anymore. It was about facing the things that were left unsaid, the words that had been left unspoken. Daniel, Keanu said quietly, pulling out the chair across from him. I didn't expect to see you here. Daniel gave a half-smile, leaning back in his chair. Yeah, it's been a while. I almost didn't recognize you. Keanu chuckled softly. You look different too. A long silence followed, one that neither man seemed willing to break. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with the weight of unaddressed years. Keanu felt the need to speak, to clear the air, to finally acknowledge the unresolved tension that had lingered between them for so long. I've been thinking a lot about the past, Daniel, Keanu said, his voice steady. About everything that happened between us. Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly curious but guarded. What about it? Keanu took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. I need to apologize. I've spent a lot of time blaming you for what went wrong, but the truth is, I didn't take responsibility for my part in it. I was hurt, and I didn't handle it the right way. I walked away without even trying to fix things. And for that, I'm sorry. Daniel stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Keanu thought he might say nothing at all. But then, after what seemed like an eternity, Daniel spoke. I've thought about that day a lot too, Daniel said, his voice quiet, but not without emotion. I know I hurt you, Keanu. I wasn't in the right headspace. I pushed you away when you needed me most. And I'm sorry for that. I was dealing with my own stuff, and I took it out on you. I shouldn't have. Keanu's chest tightened at his friend's words. It wasn't just an apology. It was an admission of vulnerability, of the struggles they had both gone through. And hearing it, after so many years, it felt like a weight was being lifted. I never wanted to walk away from our friendship, Keanu admitted, his voice thick with emotion. But I didn't know how to fix it, how to make things right. I was afraid of what would happen if I tried. Daniel nodded slowly, a look of understanding passing between them. I get that. I was afraid too. I guess we were both running from the same things. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them reflecting on the truth of what had been said. Keanu realized something in that moment. He had spent so much of his life running from people, from situations, from the things he was too afraid to face. But now, he could see that the only way forward was to face those fears, to confront the unseen. You know, Daniel said after a pause, I don't know if we can go back to what we were. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe it's about starting fresh, with no expectations, just trying to be better. Keanu nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. I think you're right. I'm not looking for things to be the way they were. But I'd like to start again. And this time, not run from it. Daniel smiled, a genuine smile that Keanu hadn't seen in years. I can do that. Later that evening, Keanu sat on the rooftop of his apartment building, the city lights stretching out before him. He had made peace with his past, but he also knew that the journey wasn't over. There were still relationships to mend, still lessons to learn. But he wasn't afraid of it anymore. He wasn't afraid of facing the hard truths, of looking at the parts of himself and others that had been left in the shadows. Keanu felt a weight lift off his shoulders that he didn't even realize he had been carrying. For the first time in years, he felt truly free. The phone buzzed in his pocket again. It was Maya, her name lighting up the screen. Hey, he answered, a smile tugging at his lips. Hey, Keanu, Maya's voice came through, bright and easy. How are you? Keanu took a deep breath, his heart still light from the conversation with Daniel. I'm good, really good. I think I'm finally starting to see things more clearly. That's amazing to hear, Maya said, her voice warm. You've been through so much, Keanu. But I always knew you had it in you. You just needed to give yourself the chance to heal. Keanu leaned back, gazing at the stars above. I've been running from so many things, Maya. But now, I'm not afraid to face them anymore. The past doesn't control me anymore. There was a pause on the other end. Then Maya spoke, her voice filled with affection. I'm proud of you, Keanu. You've come a long way. And I know you'll keep moving forward. Keanu smiled to himself, feeling the truth of her words settle into his heart. Thanks, Maya. I couldn't have done it without you. As they continued to talk, Keanu realized something important. He wasn't just healing for himself. He was healing for the people he loved, for the future he wanted to build. And with every conversation, every step forward, he was shaping a new chapter, one where the unseen fears no longer held him back. He wasn't alone on this journey. Not anymore. Keanu woke up early the next morning, the quiet light of dawn spilling through the blinds of his apartment. There was a certain peace to the morning that he hadn't realized he was missing until now. The world outside was still, the city just beginning to stir. But inside, Keanu could feel something new beginning to take root in him. A deep, almost serene understanding that he was no longer the man he used to be. The months of struggle, healing, and confronting old fears had not been easy, but they had led him to this moment. He had learned that change, true change, didn't come all at once. It was a slow, constant process, one that built on the small, often overlooked choices that, over time, created a new reality. Keanu stretched as he got out of bed and moved toward the kitchen. The coffee machine hummed to life, and the rich scent of brewing coffee filled the space. He had learned to savor these little moments, the quiet ones, the ones that didn't require anything from him except to exist in them. The phone on his counter buzzed, and Keanu's heart skipped as he saw who was calling. Maya. Hey, Maya, he answered, his voice warm. Hey, Keanu. How's it going this morning? Maya asked, her voice full of energy. It was always like this with Maya, a bright spot in his day, no matter what. Good, actually. Really good, Keanu replied, a smile tugging at his lips. I woke up feeling different. I can't really explain it, but it's like everything that's been weighing on me for so long isn't there anymore. Maya's voice softened, a knowing tone in her words. I'm so glad to hear that. I've seen the change in you, Keanu. The way you carry yourself, the way you approach life now. It's like you've finally come home to yourself. Keanu paused, his chest tightening a little at her words. It's strange. For so long, I felt like I was just drifting, you know? Like I was stuck in a place that didn't feel like me. But now it feels like I found the right direction. I think it's more than just finding the direction, Maya said thoughtfully. I think it's about realizing that you've had it in you all along. You just needed to believe in yourself, in who you're becoming. Keanu smiled, his heart full of gratitude for Maya's steady belief in him. Maybe. I've definitely come a long way. And I think the hardest part is that I'm starting to believe that I deserve a future that feels good, not just one that's about surviving. Maya chuckled softly, and Keanu could hear her grin. You definitely deserve it. And I'm so proud of everything you've overcome. You've gone through so much, and you've still come out on the other side stronger. Keanu looked out the window, taking in the sights of the bustling city below. The weight that had once felt suffocating, the pressure of expectations, the fear of failure, the guilt of past mistakes, seemed almost like a distant memory now. The lessons he had learned weren't just about confronting the past. They were about moving forward, letting go of the things that didn't serve him anymore, and embracing the future with open arms. I've been thinking, Keanu began, his voice thoughtful. I want to start something new. I don't know exactly what it looks like yet, but I feel like I need to make a change, like I need to do something that really reflects who I am now. Keanu, that's amazing, Maya said, her voice full of excitement. What kind of change are you thinking about? Keanu paused, contemplating her question. I think it's about using what I've learned, the things I've experienced, to help others. I don't want to just go through the motions anymore. I want to make an impact, even if it's small. Maybe something to do with helping people who've been through similar struggles, showing them that they're not alone. Maya's voice softened, and Keanu could almost hear the smile in her tone. I think that's exactly what you're meant to do. You've been through so much, and your story could help others in ways you might not even realize. Keanu felt a surge of inspiration. He didn't know exactly what form it would take, but he was beginning to understand that his purpose wasn't just to overcome his own struggles. It was to use his experiences, his growth, to make a difference. And in doing so, he would create a future that was built on empathy, connection, and the kind of healing that comes from sharing one's truth. As Keanu ended the call with Maya, he felt a spark of excitement in his chest. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for it. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. He had spent so long fearing change, fearing failure, fearing that he wasn't enough. But now, he realized that change was inevitable. It was a force of nature, something that shaped everything around him, and he could either fight it or embrace it. Keanu knew what his choice would be. Later that day, Keanu met up with Layla and Maya at their favorite cafe, the one they had all frequented during the toughest parts of their journeys. The three of them had shared many conversations here, but today, it felt different. Today, it felt like they were not only moving forward with their own lives, but also walking a new path together. Keanu, you look like you've had some kind of breakthrough, Layla said with a grin as she sipped her iced tea. Keanu smiled, his eyes bright. I think I've finally figured it out. I want to make a change, not just in my life, but in how I show up in the world. I don't want to just exist. I want to make a real difference. Maya raised her eyebrows, clearly intrigued. That's huge, Keanu. What kind of change are you thinking about? Keanu leaned forward, his voice steady and filled with conviction. I want to help people who've been through the same things I've been through. I've spent so long trying to heal, but I think now it's time to take what I've learned and give back. I'm not sure what form it'll take yet, but I know it's what I'm meant to do. Layla smiled softly, her gaze filled with pride. Keanu, you've always had this in you. And I know that whatever you decide to do, you're going to change lives. Keanu's heart swelled at her words. Thanks, Layla. You've both been there through all of this. I couldn't have done it without you. We're always here for you, Keanu, Maya said, her voice warm and reassuring. Keanu felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't alone. He had people who supported him, who believed in him. And he was finally learning to believe in himself, too. The future wasn't clear yet, but for the first time, Keanu was no longer afraid of the unknown. He was ready for change, and he knew that, no matter what, he was going to make it count. Keanu stood at the edge of the city's skyline, looking out at the vast expanse before him. The buildings stretched out like a concrete jungle, a web of connections and stories all intertwining, each one full of possibilities. He had spent so many years in the shadows of his own fears, paralyzed by what-ifs and doubts. But now, standing here, he felt a different kind of weight. The kind that came from possibility. The weight of knowing that change was real, and it was happening inside of him. He had spent weeks contemplating his next steps, the shape of the future he wanted to create. With Maya's encouragement and Layla's unwavering support, Keanu had begun laying the groundwork for something that had been a quiet dream in the back of his mind. A foundation, one that would help those who had struggled as he had. A space where people could share their stories, heal, and begin again. It wasn't about erasing the past, but accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward with strength and grace. But even now, as he stared out into the world, he knew the journey wasn't over. It wasn't a one-time shift, a singular moment that would change everything. It was a continual process. The world would keep challenging him, as it did with everyone. But for the first time, Keanu knew how to face it. He wasn't just standing still anymore. He was moving forward, one step at a time. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Maya. Hey, Keanu answered, his voice steady and calm. Keanu, Maya's voice came through, warm and full of hope. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. You know, about starting something to help others. Keanu chuckled softly, running his hand through his hair. Yeah. You're not alone in this, you know that, right? Maya continued. I know we've talked about this before, but I just want to remind you that you've already impacted so many people just by sharing your story. What you're doing now, it's bigger than you think. People need to hear it. They need to see someone who's been where they are and come out the other side. Keanu leaned against the balcony railing, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. I hope so. I really do. It's a big leap, you know? But it feels right. I can't ignore it anymore. Of course it feels right, Maya said, her tone sure and confident. It's what you're meant to do. And whatever you need, I'm here. Always. A warmth spread through Keanu, his heart full as he stared at the horizon. It was a new day, and while he didn't have all the answers, he finally understood the most important part. The courage to move forward. I appreciate that, Maya. Truly. I've come a long way because of you, because of all of you. Keanu took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs. I'm ready for what's next, whatever it is. As he hung up, Keanu felt the last of his fears slip away. The uncertainty of the future still loomed, but it no longer felt like a monster waiting to devour him. It was just a part of the journey, and now, he was ready to embrace it with open arms. Later that week, Keanu's new foundation launched. He had worked tirelessly with Maya and Layla, connecting with people who could help guide the project, sharing his vision with those who believed in it. The support was overwhelming. People reached out with stories of their own struggles, of their own fears and triumphs. It was more than Keanu had ever imagined, and yet, it felt like the only natural step. The day the foundation went live, Keanu stood in front of the camera, his heart beating with excitement. He had written a message, one that felt like the summation of everything he had learned over the past months. A message of hope, of understanding, and most of all, of the power of change. "Hi, I'm Keanu," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I'm here to tell you that no matter what you've been through, no matter how dark things may feel, there's always a way forward. It's not about forgetting your past or erasing it. It's about using it to build the life you deserve. We all have a story. We all have pain. But it's how we move through that pain that defines us. And together, we can heal." Keanu paused for a moment, feeling the weight of his own words settle in his chest. He wasn't just talking to the camera. He was talking to every person who had ever felt like they didn't belong, like they didn't have a place in the world. And in that moment, he knew that this was the beginning of something bigger than himself. The foundation gained momentum quickly. People from all walks of life reached out, sharing their stories, offering support, and finding a sense of community they hadn't known they needed. It was raw, it was real, and it was changing lives. Keanu found himself more fulfilled than he had ever been. Every story shared, every connection made, brought him closer to the purpose he had been searching for. He didn't have all the answers, and he never would, but he was learning to embrace the journey, to be open to the lessons along the way. As the months went by, Keanu continued to grow. He spent time with old friends, mended relationships, and deepened the ones that truly mattered. He learned to embrace vulnerability, to accept that he didn't have to be perfect, and that it was okay to stumble. What mattered most was getting back up, again and again. One evening, as he sat with Maya and Layla, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange, Keanu realized something. He had spent so much of his life fearing change, fearing failure, fearing loss. But now, he understood that it was change, the willingness to grow, to evolve, to try something new, that had brought him here. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Maya nudged him playfully. "Hey, you look like you're lost in thought." Keanu smiled, his eyes soft. "I am. Just thinking about how far I've come." Layla raised her glass in a toast. "To the future. To new beginnings." Keanu clinked his glass with theirs. "To new beginnings," he echoed, his voice full of gratitude. As the evening wore on, Keanu couldn't help but smile to himself. He wasn't sure where life would take him next, but he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer afraid of the unknown. What's your next step in your journey of change? Share your thoughts below, and remember, it's never too late to begin again.